Continuing the theme of me reviewing games on either of my Game of the Year lists for 2016 comes Radia Senki, an RPG on the Famicom by Tecmo, of all people. Seriously, Tecmo made this. Now the story follows a nameable amnesiac hero who is off to, well, basically save the world. Essentially, it's your classic story of amnesiac hero, princess on the run, versus an evil group of people trying to take over a greater power to ultimately end up dominating everyone. And in that respect, it's not the most original plot ever. However, this is again an RPG on the Famicom. And if you take into account stuff like Final Fantasy, basically being an entire paragraph of a story told to you at the end of the game, the fact that this game has the ability to introduce different characters, give the characters backstory, touch upon various humanizing issues that sort of makes it more of a real experience, issues such as racial segregation and our impact on the environment, does mean that this game's story is a lot more nuanced than you'd expect for a game on the system. It's really well done in that respect. Now, gameplay-wise, this is an action RPG, but it's pretty revolutionary for its time. And I know what you're saying, well, there have been other action RPGs on the NES/Famicom. Stuff like your favorite NES game Crystalis. Stuff like Magic of Sahara-Zod, when it's not being a weird turn-based RPG. I made a video about it, go watch it, it's weird. Stuff like Legend of Zelda, and I stop you immediately, because that's not an RPG, it's an adventure game. Big difference. But the point is, while yes, there are action RPGs on the Famicom/NES, this one's pretty interesting because it's an action RPG with a party/squad mechanic. Basically, in terms of combat, this game is the NES equivalent of any of the Tales of games. Because, as far as I'm aware, every other RPG on the Famicom/NES was basically a one character running around hacking and slashing monsters. This one you actually control an entire squad. Okay, that's a bit of a misnomer. More accurately, the entire squad sort of controls themselves using individual AI patterns, but what's really interesting is you can assign them various different orders and they will try to accomplish them. So if you want your big heavy tank guy to go attack the target on the far left, and you want your mage guy to attack the target on the far right, you can just individually tell them to do that, while you go about doing your own thing. Now, their AI isn't too bright, and their character models take up physical space, so you can actually get locked down being surrounded by your other teammates, but it's still appreciated that they gave you the option to try and tell your characters how to individually handle the situation, even though it is about as effective as just telling your teammates to go do whatever as offensively as possible, and the task will end up getting about as effectively completed either way. Still, it was a nice touch, and it does feel very innovative that they tried to do this. Another thing I think this game did that was kind of revolutionary is how it handles its encounters, because as far as I'm able to ascertain, they're sort of random and they're sort of not. Think of it sort of like a system like Chrono Trigger, where each enemy encounter is based on a set physical trigger in the world. However, unlike Chrono Trigger, where most of them are scripted and you can kind of see them coming, this time they're completely invisible. That said, once you know where they are, you can, for the most part, avoid them, as necessary. Other things of note are, each of the different characters feels like they contribute to the team slightly differently. For example, your first character, Darius, is a mage, so he'll shoot out like laser air slashes at his opponents, whereas Haman, being a knight, basically just swords everything to death. While it's a small thing, ultimately it does make each character feel a little bit more unique, and that's definitely appreciated. Other ways this game tries to differentiate your characters, aside from their physical sprite in, well, most cases anyway, as well as their way to attack, is how this game handles magic. Because magic is, somewhat similarly to the original Final Fantasy, an expendable resource. While each character, once they learn magic, knows it permanently, they have to come across a magic scroll, which then gets applied to one character of your choice, and then they learn that magic permanently. So, you basically have to find one of the finite number of magic scrolls, and then decide which character you think would be most effective at using their new magic. However, this does end up leading to one of the problems this game has, and that is, there is very little actually explained to you in the game. Going back to the example of magic, you might learn a new ability, but you have no idea what it does. In fact, using it in combat, you still might not be sure what it does because all it did was make the screen flash. So ultimately, gameplay-wise, this game was pretty unique and fairly far ahead of its time, as far as I can tell. That said, it does have its issues, and it is a little bit give or take. Now, the presentation in Radia Senki is great. Visually, it is excellent. Okay, yeah, I know. It reuses character models with palette swaps, and every character has basically 2 frames of animation. But you also have to understand that that was, for the NES/Famicom, kind of standard. And while that is very much the case here, what sets it apart from those other RPGs is the fact that it uses the patented Tecmo Theater. Now, if you're not familiar with the Tecmo Theater, it was Tecmo's pseudo-copywritten cutscene system as seen on the Famicom and NES. In fact, I'm pretty sure outside of Japan the only games we knew that had it were Ninja Gaiden. But it's kind of like that. This game ends up having anime cutscenes in it. Now granted, they're mostly at the start, but they are there, and they're very high quality, and while ultimately the rest of the game doesn't quite live up to these greatly animated cutscenes, it still pushes it a little bit ahead of the competition, I feel. And if the gameplay wasn't notable for being revolutionary at the time, this game is still a pretty historically important game, because not only does it feature the Tecmo Theater, this was actually the very last game to feature it. So if nothing else, visually, it's a pretty important game. Now, audio-wise, it's above average. The music is good, although I wish there was a lot more songs here. I love the jingle that plays when you finish a fight. I love the battle theme. I even like the town theme that sounds very reminiscent of the first town from the original Final Fantasy. Basically, while not every single one of the songs is going to be a hit, they all work for what they need to do, and it's done well. So ultimately, the overall presentation to Radia Senki is great. Now, if you want to track down a copy of Radia Senki, it's not terribly expensive. It tends to sit at about $25–30. And at that price, I'd highly recommend it. It's a ton of fun. The one caveat to this recommendation, though, of course, is being able to translate it, because, unfortunately, it was never released in North America. I'm playing it with a fan translation off an actual cart, and I gotta say the translation is fairly well done as well, but if you don't have access to this translation, while still being a pretty straightforward game, it loses a lot when you're missing out on the story. So ultimately, it's not quite as much a recommendation. But overall, I gotta say, Radia Senki is, at present, my favorite Famicom exclusive RPG. Yeah, there are some I like better on the NES, such as Crystalis, but this one is very unique and ahead of its time. It's noteworthy for a lot of different reasons, and ultimately, I gotta say this is one to pick up if you're able to play it.